Good evening. I'm Bertram de Souza, welcoming you to this special preview of Tuesday's primary election in Ohio. I use the word special because two of my guests who are appearing via Zoom have more than a combined 100 years of being on the front line of Ohio politics. Dr. William Binning, retired political science professor at Youngstown State University, got involved in politics more than 60 years ago as a Republican insider during the tenure of Governor James Rhodes. After Rhodes, Bill continued working with various Republican administrations and for a long time was a political analyst in the Mahoning Valley and around the state. Since his retirement, he has moved out of Ohio, but he hasn't lost his passion for politics. Brent Larkin has been a journalist in the state for more than 50 years, much of that time reporting on and commenting on politics. He retired from the Cleveland Plain Dealer several years ago, but still writes a weekly column for Cleveland.com. By any measure, Brent is the Dean of Political Journalists in Ohio. His commentaries are a must-read for anyone interested in state and national politics. I've known both these gentlemen for more than 40 years. I'm a retired editorial page editor and Sunday columnist for the now closed Youngstown Vindicator, where I worked for 40 years, including a stint as the paper's political writer. Joining me tonight for our special podcast, in our special podcast studio in the WFMJ TV building in downtown Youngstown, Cynthia Rickard, my co-host, who worked at the Vindicator for 41 years, retiring as an editor. This podcast is brought to you by the Scribbler Publishing Group and is being streamed live on the Scribbler Group's YouTube channel and Facebook page, WFMJ.com, and other platforms. I invite viewers to participate by calling the following number, 330-333-0604. This number will remain on your screen throughout this broadcast. If you're unable to get through, you can submit your questions or comments via voicemail. So let's get started. Bill and Brent, thanks very much for joining us tonight. Appreciate it. I hope you can hear us.
I can hear you.
Fine. Thanks, Bertram.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So let's start with this. Given your vast experience and knowledge, would each of you give us a little thumbnail sketch of your life, especially in politics? And Bill, let's go with you, since you are the senior first. I think.
What?
I think you're the senior person among us. So go ahead.
Oh, well, that's nice of you to defer to.
Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, well, I started in politics when I was a kid. I campaigned for Eisenhower as a 12, 14-year-old, and of course, I always studied politics in school. And then, of course, when I came to Ohio, as you pointed out, I got involved in local Republican politics and attached my wagon to Jim Rhodes, who was making one of his many comebacks. This is one of his. I attached my wagon to one of his comebacks, and of course also to Bob Hughes, of course, who Brent knew very well, and I just stayed in it. I was in it for probably over 30 years. I went from Rhodes to Voinovich to Taft, and then, as you pointed out, I was a local commentator for WFMJ.
And Brent, tell us about you.
Bert, I've lived my whole life in Greater Cleveland. I went to Ohio University, and I began work at the Cleveland Press, which expired in 1982, as you well know. In 1970, I began work at the Cleveland Press. I was 22 years old, and I knew nothing. And a year later, in 1971, a city editor took a chance on me and put me on the City Hall beat. And Carl Stokes was mayor.
Right.
And one thing led to another, and here I am 52 years later doing a version of the same thing. So how's that for progress? I eventually, I moved to the Plain Dealer in 1981, about a little bit more than a year before the press went under, and I've had a variety of jobs there: politics writer, columnist, editorial page editor for 20 years. Then I took a buyout and they hired me back, and I just do an occasional column for them. So
Now,
You're right.
Now, before we get into the issues, each of you has a Youngstown connection where you are, given in your lives. Bill, you're in Florida,
Yes.
where the governor, DeSantis, has some relatives in the Mahoning Valley. You're aware of that, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. His grandfather was a Republican. Phil Rogers was a Republican chairman when I first came. In fact, he helped do my petitions the first time I ran for committeeman, and that's DeSantis' grandfather. And he became a lobbyist for YSU for a number of years. His grandfather and his uncle is Father Rogers, who has a big church out in Boardman, St. Charles, and he has DeSantis has an aunt who is a nun I'm not certain what order she's in, but she's in the Youngstown area. So his
nun
mother's
for an aunt?
his family's deeply rooted. His mother's family is deeply rooted in the valley. They came out of Lowville, really Italian family. They anglicized their name.
So if you happen to bump into him, tell him we're very interested in his politics, and we'd like to talk to him about it. But Brent, you have an interesting story about when you first went to Ohio University.
When you went
into when you were
couple days ago. I began at Ohio University in 1965, and in those days, you had to stay in a dorm, especially at least your first year, and you had no choice over who your roommate was. They tossed you in with somebody. It was a random process. I showed up at Washington Hall one day, and in September of 1965, and I met my new roommate for the first year. His name was Jim Filomena.
Wow.
He was this good-looking, dashing, kind of redheaded young man, and I learned a lot from Jim. I only lived with Jim for a year. I stayed in somewhat close touch with him for Jim might have left early, but and I kept in touch with him occasionally through good times and bad for Jim throughout the rest of his life. But Jim was a piece of work in 1965, and apparently.
I can imagine.
Yeah. Well, we remember Jim well, don't we, Bill?
He was quite a ladies' man, and Jim enjoyed life. And apparently things didn't always go well for Jim in his adult years, but I have fond memories of Jim.
Well, we appreciate that story. So let's start with this. Those of us of a certain age will remember Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment to Republicans, namely, thou shalt not speak ill of fellow Republicans. That commandment was the guiding principle of the Republican Party during Reagan's 2 terms as president when he was titular head of the party. Then Donald Trump comes along in 2016, and in the Republican primary for president, not only launched personal attacks on his opponents, but let it be known that going after members of their families, especially spouses, was not only acceptable, but a winning strategy. His victory in the primary seems to have proven him right. Since then, Republicans have launched a scorched earth campaign, as evidenced by the GOP primary for the Ohio U.S. Senate seat being vacated by Republican Rob Portman. So, for the two of you, is this now the new normal for the Republican Party?
Who goes first?
Brent, go ahead.
You go, Brent.
I absolutely believe it is the new normal for the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party that you referenced a minute ago, Bertram, it no longer exists. There has been, Ohio is again kind of ground zero for this. No state has changed faster than Ohio, and the change has been seismic. And a lot of that change, for better or worse, depending on your political persuasion, has its roots in part in the Mahoning Valley. Because of, if you compare what happened there in moaning in in this century,
Right.
and and then go back and see what happened in 2016 and 2020, as I believe I just mentioned. It's been seismic what's happened to Ohio. This is a party that where I seriously doubt that people like Jim Rhodes or Bob Taft, maybe even Voinovich, who was the most successful politician, I would argue, in Ohio history by a lot.
Right.
Consider the length of his career. And are they electable? Would they be electable today? We don't know that. But we do know that a kind of normal governor of Ohio, who happens to be a Republican, may not get 50% on Tuesday in the Republican primary, which he will win, but he will win in somewhat unconvincing fashion.
Hey, Bill, so all of the names that Brent mentioned, you knew intimately, or well, I don't know to say intimately, and including Ronald Reagan. We went to the convention together. What has happened? What has happened to today's Republican Party? And is this transition, do you believe, a permanent thing?
I think it is. I mean, everything is today, so everything is permanent. Yeah, I don't think it's going to. I don't think it's going to change. I mean, it's going to change, but it doesn't mean it changes that this very negative approach to your opponent is going to dissipate. I think that's going to continue. I think one of the things, to take up Brent's point about Ohio, is that for most of our careers, the parties were very competitive. That is, the Republicans were very cautious nominating candidates because you had no certainty you were going to win. I think there's this assumption, maybe false, but there is this assumption today that whoever wins this Senate primary in particular, whoever wins this primary is going to automatically become the senator. In other words,
right.
It's not a competitive race. Ohio is sort of a southern state now. It's very Republican, and so whoever the Republican nominee is, that statewide is going to win. So that the way to win is to become the nastiest, most right-wing candidate in the primary. And you win the primary, and then you get the seat to beat the senator. So I think that's part of the politics of Ohio today. I think Brent pointed the way that it's Ohio's change to being a very Republican state that's caused this very negative, and they've taken on the Trump style. And of course, Trump is the demigod of the state. Whoever gets his blessing is somehow has. We're going to see how that works, but everybody wanted to beat Trump up until he picked somebody to be his candidate in Ohio.
So if you're a moderate Republican, as they used to be in the state of Ohio, and there were moderate Republicans who ran for office in the state of Ohio, you've become a dinosaur politically in this state, haven't you?
Ohio has
go ahead, Brent.
No, you go, Bill.
Yes, I'll hear from Brent.
Brent, go ahead.
The answer is yes. I'm a dinosaur. Moderates are dinosaurs in the party.
Ohio, all these Republican governors we've talked about, they were all, the furthest they strayed was center right in their politics and in their governing. And the Republican Party has a long history of not venturing too far into the extremist territory. I note. The one time they nominated a candidate for, the most recent time they nominated a candidate for governor who was far right was in 2006 in Ken Blackwell. And he got annihilated
Right.
by Ted Strickland.
Right.
A kind of a, not very well known Democrat from the bottom part of Ohio, and that was Ken Blackwell would do just fine.
today, yeah, he'd sit right in. But to take
Might
up
not
one
be
of,
conservative enough.
yeah, to take up one of Brent's points that the godfather of the Ohio Republican Party for the last 50 years or longer was Ray Bliss,
Right.
and what Ray Bliss was famous for was that we don't talk about the issues. There are we ignore the issues that Republicans didn't. Jim Rhodes used to say, I'm sure Brent covered him. He'd say, "Oh, now I'm going to talk about the issues," and he'd never say anything. And so the Republicans in Ohio were noted for being issueless in the way that they campaign. That's all gone now. That sort of approach to politics is all gone. But Ohio was famous for that. It's in the textbooks of state government.
Okay, before I ask the next question, let me remind our viewers that you can participate by calling in to this number 330-333-0604. And if you can't get through, you can send us your question or comments via voicemail. Let me follow up now with the question about the U.S. Senate race, the Republican primary. Brent, you recently wrote a column about it, and here's the headline to your column. Quote, "As GOP Senate campaign hits new lows, Ohioans are the losers." Close quotes. And the opening paragraphs say this, and I think that it's really telling. Selling your soul to Donald Trump comes with a no-return policy. For Mike Gibbons, Josh Mandel, and Jane Timken won't be able to buy theirs back. The former president played them for fools, rewarding their loyalty with a stab-in-the-back endorsement of venture capitalist J.D. Vance in Ohio's Republican primary for Rob Portman's Senate seat. There's a lot to delve into, given that this race has attracted national attention, because the presumed Democratic nominee will be Tim Ryan of the Mahoning Valley, who's serving this 20th year in the U.S. House of Representatives. Brent, I'd like you to talk some more about your column, what triggered it, and then Bill, I'd like you to weigh in on the endorsement, because you have some interesting insight into how this endorsement occurred that I think our viewers would be interested in. So Brent, let's go with you first.
Well, I've written at least a few columns about it, because Ohio has never had this cavalcade of clowns parade through the state, if you will. And they're trying, every day they wake up with a new idea, it seems, to try and get to the right, political right of each other. And they are true. These are loathsome. These are not necessarily loathsome human beings, but they are running loathsome campaigns, which, as far as I'm concerned, threaten to do enormous, or have already done enormous damage to Ohio's reputation. As you know, as you alluded to, the Times and the Post and the networks, they're all starting to pay close attention to it, because on Tuesday, Ohio will be ground zero for the test of Donald Trump's power in delivering for his nominees, because his endorsement of J.D. Vance, which I believe was purchased by a guy named Peter Thiel, who founded PayPal and is close to Trump. And I think there was promises of huge amounts of money changing hands, not necessarily illegally. But if he can drag J.D. Vance and all his Russian baggage across the finish line, and his love affair with Putin, and this unfathomably despicable things he said about the Ukraine, then it will strengthen Trump's hold. And this is going to be the race on Tuesday.
What's your prediction of the outcome of that race?
I can't.
You don't know.
Find it very dangerous to try and crawl into the minds of these people, of the people who are going to vote in this primary.
Right.
I think it's a two-way race. I think the only people who can win right now are Vance and Josh Mandel.
Right.
And I know for Bill probably knows this too, a $1 million TV buy, a 1 week, $1 million TV buy in Ohio is, you can get pretty much total saturation in political advertising. Friends of Josh Mandel in the last 5 days of this campaign are going to spend $4 million,
Wow.
just under $4 million in television ads, trying to drag him across the finish line first. And there's never been this type of money spent in Ohio.
Bill, you've been
Yeah,
around
well,
a lot of races, a lot of Senate races. Talk to us about this one.
Well, to take up Brent's point, they're going to spend over $60 million in this Senate race. We've never seen a Senate race. It used to be $1 million race. Now just this primary is going to be over $60 million, and that's really a change. And the other point that Brent brought up is that in this case of Vance, he's a candidate of a California, a billionaire who's financing his campaign. We've never seen anything like that in Ohio. In fact, they used to argue about who'd you get your money from, how much money came from out of Ohio. Right. Nobody seems to take any interest in the fact that this candidate, who is Trump's candidate, who's I don't know if he's going to win, but he's certainly favored. Vance is favored. Is getting all of his, or majority of his money from a California a billionaire, and that's what's really a sea change, in Ohio politics.
But Bill, that California billionaire, that wasn't an accident. He has close ties with Donald Trump, but it goes beyond that. As you had, when we had talked prior to planning for this program, you sort of suggested that I read that Vanity Fair piece about Thiel and Trump and J.D. Vance and the whole endorsement. Just give us a brief,
Well, I recommended you read it. It was a critical piece, but it went to Thiel and his interest in becoming a force in the National Republican Party, and he has his own kind of political philosophy, that's pretty close to Trump's. And he's and his entree now into the Senate is I think in this race, I'm not sure what's the other race, in Missouri or someplace. He's got Thiel's backing two candidates that will support his political views. So they have an actual political philosophy that they're bringing into that they're going to be bringing into the Republican Party. So this is not just I'm supporting my friend. This is actually a sort of a movement within the Republican Party by Thiel to become an influential player and has a group of so-called intellectuals who are giving him ideas that we would presume Vance and others will be promoting as we move down the road. Now, I do want to take up, I'll go back to that in a minute. I do want to take up a point that maybe we can talk about some more, and that is I think that if Vance does win, which he might, I think he made a big mistake on the way he talked about Ukraine. Because I think that we saw Biden today that wants all this money, that Ukraine's becoming a big deal. And I would say, and Brent knows what I'm talking about, so you, Bertram, that I don't think, in fact, I was going to make a bet with somebody on Cuyahoga County. He is not going to get the Voinovich ethnic vote that is a Trump vote out of Cleveland because of those remarks. And if the Ukraine stays as a hot issue, it could be problematic for him in the general election.
Brent, is that true?
Are you going to support the Ukraine funding? And this is going to become I don't know how many positions or opinions Vance can change over the course of his short political career. He didn't like Trump. I like Trump. Now he was against Ukraine. Now he's supporting Ukraine. So we'll see how much he dances around it. But I think that could become an interesting question.
My favorite Vance tweet because it's so short and simple about Trump was just prior to the 2016 election when he tweeted, My God, what an idiot.
Yes.
Yeah, so
But-
can you talk about that a little bit? I'm interested to know how he went from he's an idiot to getting the endorsement. Is it all tied up with this PayPal money?
I think that's a large part of it. Yeah, and he.
So they
and he-
bought him off, basically?
Yeah, but yes, and he complains all the time about elitists. That's one of his favorite words. Well, he is the very definition of one.
Right.
He's a product, a creature created in Silicon Valley.
Ivy League schools,
Right.
a
Yes.
natural author, and not anybody doesn't like elites.
From Middletown to Yale. Can I ask one question of you folks?
Go ahead.
Well, the Valley, I've always been in, there's it's always an intriguing place, but it's at the epicenter, as I mentioned before, of Ohio's this transformation, rapid transformation. And this clown of a president, he goes there, and I don't know if it was 16 or 17, and when he was referring to Lordstown, I believe,
Yes.
when he said, he pointed us,
Right.
don't sell your houses.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, this plant, nothing's changing up here. These plants are not going away, and poof, it's
Right.
gone. And in 2020, after it went poof,
Right.
he did better than he did in 2016
Yes.
in the Valley.
And
How is that possible?
because I think, and I have suggested this, and I did in several columns, Donald Trump did not win because he's a Republican. Donald Trump won because he's Donald Trump. He could have run for with any party, head of any party, and he could have won because the message he was imparting, especially in areas like the Mahoning Valley, where he talked about make America great again, that word again subscribes to a time when, and I'm going to say this, and I've written this, where white blue-collar workers had this notion that they were, in fact, if they had jobs, they could work hard, they could raise families and all of that, and they see all of that disappearing. And they see all of this talk about racial integration and equality and immigration. And Donald Trump came into the Mahoning Valley and basically said is, hey, if you're a blue-collar white male and you lost your industry, your factory job, it's not your fault. It's not your fault that you didn't go back to technical school to learn how to use a computer. It's not your fault that you didn't know, to improve yourself academically to meet the needs of the new economy and new jobs. It's the fault of immigrants. It's the fault of trade policy. It's the fault. He blamed everybody else. And if you're somebody who has lost a job, the first thing, you're not going to take responsibility for that and say, I screwed up and I should have been prepared for this. And then all of a sudden this guy comes along and tells you, hey, I'm going to fix all that. I'm going to reopen all of those big factories, steel mills along the Mahoning River that closed. And, I'm going to demand that GM bring all of its auto workers' jobs back that it sent overseas. And people wanted to believe in something. And they just believed him.
Let me interject
Go ahead, Bill.
on Bertram and Brent. And I think this needs to be explored in a deeper way. But as Bertram goes through that litany, the first person to sing that song in the Mahoning Valley was Jim Trafficant. He set the tone for. I think Jim doesn't get enough credit for setting the tone for the transformation of the Mahoning Valley to Trump. That I can't imagine that Trafficant wouldn't have been for Trump. And when I went to one of Trump's, I didn't go to his rally, he had a sort of a think fest or something at YSU, and there were half a dozen people there who were ardent Trafficant supporters, and they told me Jim would want us to be here.
Yeah.
So I think that's another way
Trump was at a think fest.
Well, they were trying to. They were trying to get. These rallies were. I don't want to divergence. But the rallies he was having, he never really said anything. He went from one emotional slogan to another, and they wanted to present him as a thoughtful person. So somebody wrote him a foreign policy speech, and he came
Right.
to YSU and he read his foreign policy speech. He had Rudy do his warm-up act for the
Exactly.
foreign policy speech.
You-
So that
And
was
Bill, the other thing that Trafficant and Trump have in common is they scare the hell out of candidates for office. You remember when Jim Trafficant, if he didn't like an office holder, he would endorse somebody to run against that office holder.
Oh, yeah.
And after some time, all of these office holders stopped crossing Jim Trafficant, except I think for Bob Hagan might have been the last one, the last man standing in that one. Trump is the same way. Look how he has scared Mike DeWine as the governor of it. Look how he has scared.
You remember, I don't mean to dwell on little things, but when the Lao wins were short.
Yes.
And when they would debate, Trafficant would put his arms around, this was physical. He would put his arms around Lao Wins and draw him closer. So
Right.
that he was abusive to Lao Wins. When he was running, he was abusive to his opponents.
The same way that Trump did
same-
with Hillary Clinton.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I have to say that as I watch GOP politics, for me, it's just politics of fear now. They are instilling fear in the American public that, as Bertram said, the white majority in this country is losing power, ceding jobs, and I think that all of the candidates that follow Trump have taken his lead. So it's completely politics of fear, and this whole MAGA movement is based on going back to the so-called quote-unquote good old days, when women were under men's thumbs and kids were under the thumbs of authoritarian leaders in schools. Everything that they do is based on fear and pumping up the white male majority in this country. When Trump came in and said, don't sell your houses, we're going to bring back all those factories, he just built on the fear that this entire valley has had since the steel mills closed. If you don't do this, you're going to lose more jobs, you're going to lose more factories, you're not going to get anybody to come in. So the whole GOP movement now looks to me like a movement of fear.
The Youngstown Sheet and Tube closed when? I think Carter was president,
Right.
am I right?
You're right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And Carter was punished in 1980
Right.
by voters up there, was he not?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
But Trump was not punished
Exactly.
for losing Lordstown on his watch.
Yeah. I mean, and then it appears, though, that many Republicans today, led by Trump, believe that the party has a winning strategy by stomping on women's rights, especially on the highly personal issue of abortion, rolling back on advances made by blacks, especially at the voting booth, enacting state laws against LGBTQ Americans, clamping down on non-white immigration, especially at the U.S.-Mexico border, and even dictating what should be taught in the classroom. Is this the future of the GOP?
But the culture wars, sure. Well, I think it is because it has now become the party of the undereducated, white, mostly males, females, and that's not the Republican Party that we grew up with. But
Bill, what happened to your Republican Party that you grew up with?
Well, I point out it's changed, and it's quite a different party, and the people who vote in it, who make up the core that Vance is trying to appeal to, the Trump voter now, I think it's really shocking what we saw in the last 10 years. The Trump voter is really the core, I think, of the primary vote, at least here, and probably throughout Ohio. And so it's a very different party. That it is, in many cases, white working class males that make up the party. It used to be, quote, elites, bank managers,
Right.
people like that made up the the Republican Party. Many of them have left the Republican Party, and because there's not room for everybody, and so we have it's a different party, a different base, and a different set of norms and values and issues. So it's a very different.
As a political scientist, have you seen this kind of a transition of a major party to the extent?
Yeah, you see it. All parties change. I mean, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery in its day,
right?
And so the Republican Party was a party of protectionists with McKinley, and then it was the Free Trade Party. Now it's a protectionist party again. The Democratic Party is a party of elites in many respects. You know, I accept this argument being made that this loan forgiveness program is really pitched to a certain class of Americans who have money, and so the Democratic Party's changed a lot. It's really not a working class party anymore. It's a coastal elites that run the Democratic. So the parties have changed in dramatic ways. It probably was occurring, but we see it's pronounced today, and so it'll change again. But yes, to answer your question, Bertram, parties changed a lot. The Republican Party changed a lot.
Here's a good way of. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm done.
Go ahead, Brent.
There is a great way of thinking about this. We have 7 candidates in the Republican primary. Discard 2 of them because they're not spending any money. There's 5 of them who are spending an enormous amounts of money. Only one of the 5 is the type of Republican who we've spent the last 40 minutes or so talking about, you know, the DeWine, Voinovich, Rhodes type of Republican. 1 out of 5. So you would think that Matt Dolan,
right,
given the math of this thing, when you got, should have a real shot at winning. He's spending a lot of money. He's an effective state senator. He's not nuts. And
wow, that's a low bar.
Many of them can't clear it. And he's running an acceptable campaign. He's highly unlikely to win. 1 out of 5.
We've spent most of this time talking about the GOP, and I just wanted to focus on the Democrats. And I need to add that independents outnumber Democrats and Republicans in this country today. So it's astounding to me that we still spend so much money on these parties to elect people. But moving to the Democrats are horrible at messaging. So what's the problem there? I mean, all they have to do is lift a page from the GOP playbook, and particularly Trump's playbook, of repeat, 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 and they can get people to believe them, apparently. What is the Democrats' problem? Because it's local races, it's state races, it's national races. They don't seem to be able to respond to these insane attacks that GOP candidates make. The first response that I've seen is the one that went viral recently by the Michigan Senator, Mallory McMurrow.
Wasn't she tremendous?
She was amazing. She's my new hero.
Everyone should watch that.
Yeah, amazing. But what's the problem with Democrats?
Well, Sherrod is the only person in Ohio who's figured out a way to maintain his base, but they're coming for Sherrod in 2 years, by the way, and
right.
You know, we can talk about that's a subject. I'm getting ahead of myself, but they are coming for him, and no one should assume that he can win a 4th term without a heck of a fight. But I think the culture wars things, there's a sense of basic human fairness, and Bertram alluded to all the issues that they raise, but can we, and that's what resonates with Ohio. And so Ohio, back to the issue of, is an undereducated state. It's less educated than Pennsylvania and Michigan, and I'm not sure about Indiana, but it's it's a message that resonates, and I don't know, the Democrats have not figured out a way to counter that culture wars argument. I agree. I don't know if I know what it is.
Go ahead,
either.
Bill.
Well, I was just going to say, does anybody think that if the court overturns Roe, that will become a dynamic in this Senate race or for the Democrats nationally?
I think it's the one issue that has a chance of generating
Right.
voter intensity in November. It is, politically speaking, it might be their best hope.
Right, but you have to admit, I mean, the Democrats are in a very difficult place. I mean, what more can Biden ask for? The economy didn't grow, and the inflation's 10%, and then you're going to keep us in power. That's not going to work.
Right.
I think the only thing that's going to save them is the war,
But
or maybe abortion might help us, a cultural fight. I don't know how that's going to play, but the Democrats with Biden are in a very bad position with the economy going into the November election, and the longer it stays that way, the more. I don't care what issues you have to speak for, what cultural issues you bring up. People are very upset about the condition of the economy, and they're going to blame the Democrats because Biden's president.
Tim Ryan is going to wake up Wednesday morning an underdog against whoever survives this Republican primary.
Okay, let me read a comment that was sent in by one of the viewers. His first name is Matt. He says this: jobs in this area didn't go away because of President Trump. Those jobs are and have always been held hostage by the Democrats in power. We voted red. They punished us by taking the jobs. To blame the terrain of a political landscape on the party that the people are leaning towards is either delusional or ignorant. The party in power is the cause of the shift. So, and I don't expect you guys to respond to this, but that sort of suggests, that gives you some insight into what, at least one viewer and one Mahoning Valley resident thinks.
That's good. That might be Matt, who I bet with, and he wanted to point out that in our last round he won the bet, so who was going to win. So when we make our forecast,
yes,
go to that.
Okay. In the Ohio governor's race, Republican incumbent Mike DeWine is facing aggressive challenges from former Congressman Jim Bernanke and businessman Joe Blystone. Although DeWine is leading in the polls, is this race still up in the air? Bernanke's harsh criticism of DeWine's handling of the COVID pandemic has gained traction among Republican voters. Among the Democrats, of course, the two candidates are former Cincinnati Mayor John Cranley and former Dayton Mayor Nan Whaley. They've not ignited the passions of their party faithful at all. Look at the high, undecided vote in those polls. Now that is eye-popping. So what do you think will be the outcome of the Republican and Democratic primaries for governor? Bill, let's start with you, since you.
Well, I think that Brent set the bar, but I think that the incumbent governor is DeWine is going to win. I think the question is, and this is one of my bets that I have, is he going to go over 50%?
Right.
And I don't think so. And so the other two are going to split and they have their own base, but they're going to be 20, 30% in total, 20, 30, 50 some percent of the vote combined. And he's going to run in I think he's going to run in the high 40s.
Brent?
I think he's going to run in the high 40s. I'm not parroting Bill. I think he's going to be close to 50. Probably won't get there. Is Ohio? I don't think Ohio's ever had. This governor is not particularly well liked among members of his own party. Have we ever had a governor who is more popular among people who are not members of his own party?
Bill?
Not that I know of. This is, and also it would be. I mean, I think we all think that DeWine is favored in the general and might have an easy race because the Democrats to go to her for the Democrats. I really don't have very strong candidates. I mean, nobody ever heard of these people. They don't even know who's going to win the primary.
Right. Yeah.
And so they get a real battle. But I just want to make the point: it would be very unusual in the past for a candidate incumbent. A candidate who's an incumbent to get less than 50% in their party primary and then be the favorite going into the general election. But that's what we have today in Ohio.
DeWine is despised. The reason for this is because of the pandemic. That is the genesis of it all. And he's done their bidding on guns. He is in line with traditional Republican thinking on abortion.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It all goes back to those early days of 2000.
And then you also realize just how weak he is as governor when the Republican-controlled legislature writes roughshod over him on the pandemic issue.
Yeah.
Hey, Bill, you, in addition to teaching political science courses, I believe you also thought public health policy or something like that, right?
Yes.
Have you ever known a chief executive of a state to be sort of neutralized on public health policy where the legislature takes over?
This is all new. I mean, this is new to the period of the pandemic. But what we've seen, which I think is, I don't think people would agree with me, but sort of concerning in the future, where public health decisions generally are made by professional people who are trained professionally in public health and can recommend policies on immunization or water quality, et cetera, and they're not sort of out of the bounds of politics, except the politician is supposed to fund it. But in this case, as you point out, what the Ohio Republicans in the legislature did was take many of those public health decisions away from the executive branch and make them legislative decisions, which would very much politicize in the future those kinds of decisions as to whether kids need what shots to go to school next year. It no longer is a sort of a decision of an epidemiologist, but a decision of a legislative committee. So I think that, but this isn't the only state that's occurred. What's probably notable about it is that it was the Republicans at war with the Republican governor. Occurs within the same party. We have this.
Brent,
in
go ahead. Sorry.
Michigan has a Democratic governor, and they dislike her even more, I think, up there. But what kind of I think it speaks to us as a society when you have this, when you have armed Ohioans openly carrying their weapons, parading past the home of Amy Acton in suburban Columbus, because she wanted them to wear, I almost said a real bad word, but she wanted them to wear a mask.
All right.
Yeah.
That's where we've come when these nut jobs spend their time outside of her house where she has children inside.
Now anybody can carry a gun with no
thanks to
regulations. Who was essentially her boss.
Brent, let me ask you this: can you imagine Jim Rhodes allowing the legislature to do what this legislature did to DeWine?
Well, he would have cut a deal with Bern Reif, and that would have
been that.
Right?
Or he would have threatened Republicans and actually
Yeah.
would have punished them in some way.
And
if
he
they-
would have, and he would have punished
He
them.
would
Yeah.
have, absolutely. And so it speaks to just.
He never would have forgiven or forget.
I know, Bill.
All
you-
the relatives and friends who were on the state payroll would have lost their job.
I know, Bill. I remember you had the list.
Those were the days.
I know. Yes, they were. There is another caller, viewer
Yeah.
has sent in a.
Well,
comment.
first, yeah, there's a viewer named Tim who took exception to your characterization of Democrats as coastal elites, saying he guesses it's better than white nationalists. But the question is, he's asking, how can it be possible that Republicans have allowed their traditional ideals to be cast off? DeSantis, really? Anti-Disney, anti-business? McCarthy? Is the Republican Party dead? We've covered some of that, but Bill, I think you probably should take this
Well, I
first.
think the Republican Party's changed in dramatic ways. Yeah, I think that's an accurate assessment, but I don't think it's dead. I think we're looking in the midterm at a big Republican win in the state houses and in the national legislature. I think the only question is the U.S. Senate, just because of the way seats are aligned and who's up as to whether the Republicans are going to take the Senate, but certainly they're going to take the House. So the Republican Party is not dead, and
Is there
I think
still
the
room in the
question
Republican Party for moderates, Bill, or do you think they're done now?
not in the not in leadership, not in getting nominated to office. I mean, who is the leading contender after Trump is DeSantis, and he every week he takes an extreme position on some issue because he's running for president just in case Trump doesn't run. He's there, and I don't think anybody would deny that he's not the front runner if Trump doesn't run.
Let's say that Ronald Reagan's Republican Party is dead, and I think.
Well, Reagan was considered a conservative in the day, and the moderate Republicans didn't want Reagan to be the nominee. So he wasn't considered in his day he was considered a Goldwater Republican, a conservative Western Republican.
But he would be unelectable today, just
Right.
solely on the fact he supported reasonable gun control measures. After the Brady bill, et cetera.
Right.
That's disqualifying today.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end of an hour, and I promised Brent that we'd keep it to an hour and then come back next Thursday. If we'll arrange that to do a postmortem if it's agreeable, and perhaps be joined by Tom Suttis, that Bill also knows well. But let's talk.
Are we predicting Vance a winner? I'm predicting.
That's what I'm coming to now. So, are we ready to predict? Bill, let's go with you because you love to place money on stuff like this. So go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going with Vance, but I'm not as confident as I usually am. Just because I don't think the Ohio Republican people feel that they know him because he sort of just came on the scene, and I don't know that they're really comfortable with him. So if he doesn't lose, that's a reason. Otherwise, Trump will carry him over the finish line.
I think he looks and he comes off to me as unlikable. I do think he's a phony. Well, they all are and Josh has remade himself. I've known Josh for 25 years.
Right.
But if Bill is right, and he may be, it will be an astonishing win for Trump. It really will be, because this guy was in the high single digits not very long ago. If he can pull this Vance across the finish line, I think he's going to come. I think Josh has got a very good chance of winning.
So if
no one else can win, it's one of those two.
If Vance does not win, what does that say about Donald Trump?
Well, I think in part it's going to depend on what happens in Pennsylvania and some of the other. And look at the Georgia governor's race.
Right.
Trump's candidate, Purdue, is going to get annihilated. So it's time to, isn't it time to move beyond this guy?
Bill?
Well, I think it's a mistake for we used to always think it was a mistake for a president. FDR tried to do that. I mean, he did it for policy reasons. He recruited people to run against conservative Democrats who weren't supporting the New Deal, and he was unsuccessful. And that became a lesson, I think, for presidents. And it's unheard of for ex-presidents to do what Trump is doing, and that is to stick his nose in every little race.
Right.
And oftentimes because he has agreements. I think it's idiocy, and it's bad for the party. And that's one of the reasons we may not get the Senate is because of Trump. But that's nothing's going to stop him. I don't think. I mean, he's just out there, and he's still claiming this election was stolen, and people have to support him on that. Well, I mean, people want to get his endorsement, have to agree with the stupid idea that he has. The election was stolen. It's a fantasy land we're living in. But you know what really could change this is this war. If it doesn't subside, if it gets to be hotter, then it really could change the dynamic of the election. That's the only thing I think. See, I mean, I don't think the Republicans are hurt. I think they're going to win anyway, despite Trump, even if he doesn't get all his people over the line. But I'm interested. I guess because of Biden's interest in getting $30 billion today.
Right.
It's going to be a long, grueling war.
Yes.
People are going to have to pick sides. That may factor into this election.
And Americans don't have a very long attention span anymore.
Right.
There could come a time when Americans say, okay, let's cut our losses over there. And, we don't really care what happens in Germany and France and England and, Scandinavia.
Well, that's what Vance is saying. Vance is saying that.
That is his message. And, yes. My mother became a drug addict because some Mexican kid crossed the border, and that's nothing implied in his message. That is his message.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, thank you. This was fascinating. Glad we were able to do this, and look forward to next week, where we'll be able to look at the results and have each of you analyze.
Very good.
Thank you. So we're going to do the close now. Prior to each election, the Youngstown Vindicator would publish an editorial urging voters to go to the polls with this admonition: democracy is not a spectator sport. It's our hope tonight's program has inspired you to perform your civic duty and let your voice be heard in Tuesday's primary election. We thank our guests, Dr. Bill Binning and Brent Larkin, for participating in this important discussion and sharing their insights into the Republican and Democratic primaries, especially for the U.S. Senate seat in Ohio's governorship. We'll have a postmortem next week, and we'll invite another prominent commentator to join us. Our thanks to Robert McFerrin of 21 WFMJ TV, who produced this podcast, and Andy Kunkel, the technical director, who is on the staff of Triad Production Group, a division of WFMJ. Please remember to click on the subscribe and share buttons on our Scribbler Publishing Group YouTube channel. You can also find us on Facebook and WFMJ.com. The Scribbler Publishing Group has published a book, No Holds Barred, that features about 300 of the 1,600 plus columns I wrote during my 40 years at the Vindicator. It can be purchased on scribblergroup.com or Barnes & Noble in Boardman. I'm Bertram Souza, wishing you a pleasant evening.